I'd like to ask you to do something for me before I get started, or I'd like you to write these numbers down, if you can. Between 2009 and 2015, the total number of medical prescriptions dispersed in the United States was 3.95 billion. The total global number of surgeries estimated in 2004 numbers worldwide is 235 million surgeries, hospital surgeries. The pharmaceutical quality and quantity control aspect, monitoring the proper product quality and in large quantities, is a $350 million industry just for one chemical that I'll be talking to you about today. And just in diabetes drug testing, injectable insulin, 25.8 million people have to deal with the bacteriological quality of injectable drugs just for diabetes controlled. So those numbers, if you can just keep them in mind, I think they'll be more important or more prevalent in the presentation here. This presentation is not about dinosaurs. However, a species, a group, actually only 4 particular species of an individual organism, an invertebrate, which has been described as not only a seminal species in the protection of certain habitats and its importance ecologically and as a paleo survivor, but as a sentinel species, one telling us something about the quality of the environment that we're associated with or the impacts that humans have on environments, is probably more important and has been on Earth longer than the entire span of time, geological time, that dinosaurs roamed the Earth. As a matter of fact, this particular group of organisms, horseshoe crabs, probably walked below the legs of brontosauruses in their time period. And for 150 million years, these organisms predominated the landscape of Earth. But just recently, dating back to just at the cusp of the Cambrian, 455 million years, paleolimuli has been identified, along with an assemblage of invertebrates that predominated the early paleo-oceans, organisms that today we look at them for not only their fossil importance in looking at Earth history. New York State's state fossil is Eurypterids, the organisms that you see right here, these guys, all right? So we have a great appreciation of these animals primarily because of their paleo survival. Much discussion today about the idea of extinction events, the 6th extinction, on the press, in publications. But at the time that these organisms survived or existed in the early oceans, these are the only living, as they say, fossils today. They've survived 5 mass extinction events, and they're still with us. So just from their paleo history, these organisms have earned a protection. They should have been protected just for that, for the study of their survivability. Group the arthropods on the cusp of crustaceans, chelicerates, organisms that have legs that surround their mouths, are a unique group of organisms, all right? Mostly found basically related to scorpions and to other types of insects that are associated with their ability to feed, their ability to get oxygen, and there's a relationship also with crustaceans. Though the Crustacean Society has embraced horseshoe crabs only recently, There's still a debate associated with that, but the important thing is that invertebrate species, for all intents and purposes, unless you see them during their breeding times, most people don't see them. There's attention to horseshoe crabs only in the time that they're coming mating, because they're coming up onto the shore and they're kind of strange looking or alien looking, so there's a bit of attention. But there's a more important aspect to them in the ecological, and I hope that will come out this morning. Again, based upon their survivability, they outlived an organism that existed on the planet much longer, even longer than the dinosaurs were existing here, the trilobites. So there's, again, a connection to paleo history. And the physiology is some of the portions associated with that. I won't go into the details here, but certainly from the standpoint of a good body plan, a good opportunity reproductive plan, all of these types of things have allowed for its survivability and contribute to the attention we give to them, because associated with their survival, there's a certain practical use of these organisms, and we'll talk about that, or I'll talk about that in a moment. So, again, dated back to Paleolimuli, this is the oldest Mesolimnius, 455 million years ago. And this is in the fossil record. But these animals have a torturous history. They were used for fertilizer for many years. And when there was no real discussion about their populations, something like 4 million in this particular year collected just for fertilizer. So the replacement with chemical fertilizers, petroleum fertilizer, did something in a positive vein and protected these animals. They're not really used for fertilizer anymore, but they are collected for consumption, and we'll talk about that in a moment. We also have a very unique habitat for these organisms, one that you all, coming to an association and a presentation like this today, are well aware of. This fragile edge we call our barrier islands and barrier beaches. This is basically the New York Bight apex, the Bight area, portion that's been studied. New York State has a very unique category in all of the states in the National Estuarine Program. It has 4 major estuarine programs sponsored by EPA. The only one that's not sponsored by EPA is the South Shore Estuarine Reserve, which is under the New York State Department of State. But the idea of estuaries, the most productive ecosystems on the planet that we know of, and they're nursery grounds for hosts of organisms, and a place in which they are transitional places between the terrestrial environment and the near ocean and the ocean environment, ecotones. And ecologists understand ecotones as being very dynamic, very challenging environmental conditions. So just understanding their resiliency or their ability to survive even in those particular environments is pretty important. And this particular environment here, along the coastlines, as you can, this is it's a very poor photo, but it's an old one. The idea of development along the shore. Every man, woman, and child in the United States, all of you will spend at least 10 days, minimum 10 days a year in some type of coastal activity. 2/3 of the world's population lives within an hour's drive of the coastline, the shoreline. In the last decade, in the last 2 decades, the most cataclysmic events that have taken place have been coastal issues, from Fukushima in Japan to Katrina and Sandy. All types of events that take place, large-scale meteorological events are played out, and geotechnical events are played out along the coastline. So not only this dynamic habitat is important just for its ecological significance, but it's the dramatic influence, the face to more and more people and more infrastructure and more development that is critical and impacting these particular habitats. Just remember, if you haven't forgotten, or if you have forgotten, $60 billion just for Sandy alone went in for infrastructure in New York State. $60 billion. So when we start talking about, wouldn't that be wonderful if that kind of money was available for research and scientific investigations to talk about, or any type of research, cancer research at a minimum. The coastline is still a very dynamic place, psychologically, emotionally, but ecologically as an ecotone. And it's this Spartina marsh, coastal intertidal marshes that are critical habitats. And so we have these very important places that have to be protected, and we can see little remnant indications of horseshoe crabs coming ashore, even if you don't know them. But these types of habitats are dwindling. They're impacted by that infrastructure development, by the sheer population, human population, coming closer and closer to the shoreline. We can find their nesting habitat, nesting activities rather, in their habitat. We can track them through up into a point where there's some obstacle, some kind of jetty, some kind of physical structure, some kind of new condominium development, parking lot, you name it, airport, runway, whatever might be proposed taking place to support that burgeoning population has an impact, but the impact has to be not just an acute one, it's a chronic contribution to their entire biology and conservation. If an animal can't get to a breeding site because they have to climb over rock jetties, the probability will be that they won't get there. So we need to have more attention to these animals along the coastline. Their biology is still being studied, the conservation. In the abstract submitted for today, I gave this kind of abridged history in the last decade. We started with the first International Conference on Horseshoe Crab Biology and Conservation in 2007 in New York, and in 2009 it was published. In 2011 we did the first Asian Horseshoe Crab Conference in Hong Kong University, at City University in Hong Kong. And then we worked on a project just in 2015 for the second conference, because more and more Asian habitat sites have been identified, and this entire process began with attention to the IUCN, International Union of Conservation of Nature, designation of species as red listed. Red listing species is the international endangered species listing. Limulus polyphemus has just been listed, red listed. The other three species I'll talk to you about have not, but it leads to their biology and to the knowledge base about these animals. More than likely, the attention to these animals is this single event during their breeding season, the kind of the wow factor coming onto the shoreline, seeing quite a few of these coming into Delaware Bay, for example, which is the epicenter on the east coast of the United States for horseshoe crabs. Those particular sites, now called the Carl Schuster Preserve, protected basically for harvesting. These animals are protected, and they're seeing the numbers stabilize and increasing in the Delaware Bay portion of the east coast of the United States. The males generally come ashore first, females follow about. The animals cluster in marshes. If you've ever had a chance to go to Delaware Bay or Prime Hook Beach, Slaughter Beach in Delaware, along the Maryland coast, it's an amazing experience. You should do that, certainly beginning in May, early in June. High tide, full moon, their relationship to lunar cycles and to luminosity is very important. A Nobel Prize was won in studying the eyes of horseshoe crabs. So there's a tremendous scientific history here, and as much as we've identified and as much as we know very little about these animals, as primarily because of their decline throughout the world. And I'll show you in a minute, but this is on Delaware Bay. The other major part of, here's a few of the animals coming ashore, is the fact that this mating activity is a unique opportunity for, if you wanted to take a look at the idea of genetic diversity and the idea of impacts on populations in general. This is called amplexus, male. Its physiology is such that it attaches to the female. You can tell how long the females have been involved with this it's a reproductive groove that's associated with here when they're sexually mature. Each female will put between 80 and 100,000 eggs in a single nesting season. They usually have 4 or 5 nesting periods. A single male will come ashore to inseminate, fertilize the eggs left in the sediment. But there will be other males that will come about. They're called satellite males, and they'll all be fertilizing these eggs along the coast. And because of that, here's a good picture of that. This genetic diversity is a part of probably attributable to its paleo survival. So it's a portion that is still being studied to this day. We're actually doing work associated with ocean acidification and the impacts on pH changes in estuarine environments and whether or not juveniles and larvae of the animal are impacted. They are invertebrates, so from the standpoint of their growth and maturation is associated with molting. The molting process is still fascinating to me, and here the females go through 17 molts, the males 16 molts. This is over a 10 to an 11-year period. In that time period, most of the molts take place within the first year or two. They're called instars. There's at least 10 instars. We've been able to, in our laboratory, which we do captive breeding for these animals, have gotten them up to about the 10th instar. We have a few animals that are several years old, but globally, this has been a problem, a concern about captive breeding this particular invertebrate, and I'll talk to you about why that is in a moment. So the animals come ashore, high tide, full moon. There's a whole bunch of organisms that are attached, encrusting interiorly, exteriorly, these all over the prosoma of the animal. Here, you slipper shells, all types of organisms that are attached to the carapace. And here's just a single nest of eggs that are produced in nature. About 21 days or so gestation from the point till they get to their trilobite larvae. You can see their eyes, you can see all of the types of things, and certainly their tail has started to come in as they move into juvenile stage after several weeks. They use up their particular yolk within their eggs. There's a whole bunch of groups that are associated with monitoring for eggs in sediments. Green sand and eggs are one of the important programs. But again, its history to its distribution connected to its paleo history. They're only found on the east sides of continents. Limulus polyphemus, this is its range here. Down, you can actually put a flag in the beach right outside of Tallahassee in Florida. You won't find them breeding west of that. And in the Yucatan, right? Same thing in the Yucatan, at the tip of the Yucatan Peninsula. In the Asian species, 3 species, 2 Tachypleus, 1 Carcinoscorpius. These are found in the Bay of Bengal, all the way to the tip, 1 island in the tip of Japan, which has been reduced down to like 2 or 3 pairs coming ashore each year. And along the China coast, through to Hong Kong here, and Taiwan. And in Taiwan, they're called the marriage crabs. Every wedding gets together because that's what they do. And they paint the carapaces, so there's a social connection to horseshoe crabs in Taiwan. In southern Taiwan is the world's largest aquarium. They have a whole wing where they captive breed horseshoe crabs, and they can't get them past 10th instar as well, but I'll show you some of the problems there. And then in this portion of Asia, and we know nothing about very little about the animals in Vietnam, in the Philippines, in Indonesia, but there are some facts that I'll be bringing to you in a moment. This portion of the world is where the major attention for IUCN, and why that is true, because all 3 of those species are really in trouble, in dire straits. The numbers are dwindling, and yet there are 7,000 islands in the Philippines, and not a single one of those islands has been explored for horseshoe crab populations. Another part of this organism's existence is its ecological Synchrony to migratory birds. If you're an ornithologist or a biologist interested in birds, you know that they're linked to red knots, ruddy turnstones, and other coastal birds, migratory birds that come from as far away as Terra del Fuego up into Canada, into breeding portions into Alaska. Here are some laughing gulls. Birds all along the coastline, tens of millions of birds feeding on the eggs as a protein source. Endangered species, piping plovers, all types of organisms along the shoreline, synchronized to the migration of horseshoe crabs. And so you have this paleo survivability, you have this ecological conservation contribution in the migratory protection of other species, a multi-species concept, and then just their idea of being substrate for a host of invertebrates, fouling organisms, which, again, most people don't worry about unless they're scraping them off a boat or something. But the important part of this is that they have an ecological niche. And just a few quick showing you some of those. Again, the satellite males. The animals are collected at Molloy College. We have an inventory each year. We look for volunteers. Any volunteers? All right. We have an opportunity to measure across the carapace, across their eyes, and sometimes they're labeled, tagged. So there's a bunch of tagging programs. We don't necessarily do that, but there are opportunities for doing that. And they're constantly in any dredges or any types of work that's being done in estuaries in the sediment. I worked for the National Park Service for 24 years, some 20 years ago, and we did some underwater photography of horseshoe crabs coming into New York Harbor. And as they come in, they move into the Rockaway Inlet as the sites we had, and they, like cattle, they graze along mussel beds into the estuary, into the marsh, and you don't see them until they obviously come on shore, but if you're out doing any trawling, you will see them. Again, they're compound eyes, very important. They have a host of 10 other what are called ocelli, or primitive eyes, like in scallops. And then the third important part of their seminal importance is the fact that they have a practical application to your and my health. Their blood is blue, it's copper-based. It has a unique characteristic in its ability to be spun down to get the amoebocytes. It's collected. 600,000 animals worldwide are collected each year and bled to produce a chemical in North America called limulus amoebocyte lysate, LAL. Every hospital, every surgery, every one of those injectable drugs that I mentioned to you as bits of information have had LAL used to determine gram-negative bacteria, which is very important. The endotoxin aspect of gram-negative bacteria is that it creates sepsis if it gets into your respiratory system or circulatory system. So the practical factor of $350 million as an industry is very important. There's a debate today that is still going on about having synthetic LAL, so we wouldn't have to depend on this. Millions of dollars has been spent in laboratories to determine this, but there are problems at FDA and a host of other, what I call political with small p concerns. But the original test was the rabbit test, endotoxin test for rabbits, and they were injected and had to wait 48 hours. There was a long time frame. So your health protection, the quality control and quality assurance of your health is improved through the use of the blood of horseshoe crabs. That alone should be enough to protect them for what they're being used in other capacities. This is just showing that we still don't know much about their physiology, changes in their abnormalities associated with their telsin and other types of things are recurrent. Scientists look at that, what significance that might be ecologically. The idea of recreational fishing. In the United States today, twice the total tonnage of fish caught in the United States twice as much in recreational fishing as in commercial fishing. So the impact on coastal resources from fishing lines and all these types, this animal can never get out of something like this. These two totally enthusiastic young men were involved in taking a look at horseshoe crabs. I always get, everyone, when I show this picture, people say, well, you're not supposed to pick them up by their tail. That's not a problem, really, not to worry too much. You don't swing them around a little bit, but you definitely, the idea of citizen science, student science, working in the environment, getting out to take a look at these animals is very important. And we say if we see the animals along the coastline, just flip them, get them back into online. But the idea of North American horseshoe crab concerns, it was always kind of an interest. As a scientist, you might be interested in that. As a person walking the beach during the summer, you might be interested in knowing, raising some questions. But the international aspect of this has really loomed recently, not only because we've been talking more about it, but dating back to a time in China when a proposal was to reintroduce captively bred animals in Hong Kong Harbor. And if anyone has been to Hong Kong Harbor, it's got probably one of the largest mud flats ever. It goes for like 20 miles, and yet inside that harbor is everything that's associated with environmental pollution problems, from discharges to landfills to what have you. But it has major habitat for Tachypleus, which is another organism, two species of Tachypleus, which are identified for producing TAL, not limulus, but Tachypleus amoebocyte lysate. And again, in China and in Japan were the first pharmaceutical companies to capitalize on building this, this pharmaceutical miracle drug, literally. It's actually being used by NASA, was used by NASA in the space shuttle program. In the gold rooms for satellites, they would use LAL to find out if there's any contamination in any way on these satellites. So in Hong Kong Harbor, at City University of Hong Kong, 70,000 juveniles are grown in a laboratory. But interesting things about communist countries is that they can cordon off an entire estuary and don't have to really worry about regulations. And so they have actually buildings that they built on top of horseshoe crab habitat. The animals come in and they mark them and they label them. They keep, this entire bay is closed off so that the adults can be maintained. And back in 2011, this motley crew of scientists got together to talk about the conservation of horseshoe crabs on an international scale. And something happened there. And this is what scientific convocations are all about. You talk, most science is done in the hallway. You're chatting, you're talking, going through, and someone told us that really these animals are being harvested not just for their blood, but for food, that they become an exotic food staple. And Asian populations, the Asian palate is very unique. They just about consume anything that comes out of the ocean. This group found out that they were harvesting in Singapore 10,000 adult crabs a day, bleeding them out, and then taking whatever flesh, putting them into a little plastic bag, and shipping it to the fish market. At that rate, ladies and gentlemen, in the next 10 years, we will not see those three species of horseshoe crabs at that rate, 10,000 a day. So the idea was to emphasize maybe the captive breeding. So in Hong Kong University, that's being done, 70,000 a year being put out into the mudflats. And this is what's happening at Molloy College, though we're not reintroducing them. Unfortunately, the state of New York is concerned, and we're negotiating, talking to them a little about it. They consider it stocking. It's not exactly a stocking issue, but there are some concerns here, and it's taken a while to develop the technique for captive breeding of these animals. We keep the nets individual pairs together. We have to mimic the environmental conditions. Here's a single spawn in the laboratory, several 100,000 of them. Many of them are not viable. And so in order to help with this captive breeding program, or at least get the attention to this, we've started something called the Crab Club. Every high school in the city of New York is the goal, to have 1,000 of these eggs shipped to the high school in the beginning of the year and through the academic year, they raise and then bring them back to at the end of the school year. We've got 18 high schools right now doing this, started with Rachel Carlson High School in Brooklyn. These are the high schools that are bringing them through. So again, it's a small step, but it's something that needs to be promoted and increased. Here's a single spawn at the CERCOM laboratories. They get into the first, second, and third instar, the molts. Again, they're going through the series of molts, 16, 17 molts, depending, and you can't tell whether they're males or females until they at least get up to that terminal molt, which is 10 or 11 years. So obviously the time frame for captive breeding is a lot different from normal captive breeding activities. They're fed with brine shrimp, and then they start to get to a stage where you can identify them and see them. We have about 2,000 of these adults. We have actually several that are about 8 years old. Along with the idea of captive breeding is the fact that if at some point they're actually placed out into the wild has to be there. And so we identify, and this is our annual monitoring program, 111, we're out there, we add beaches each year, 111 sites from the tip of Brooklyn, tip of Montauk. These sites are identified, have beach captains. The beach captains volunteer. They go out and do some measurements on the animals along the beach. They have a form that they fill out. They do this online now. And the numbers that are coming back after this time period, this 13-year trend, is that there's been a slight decline in the numbers. But as an ecologist, and you will learn this if you don't know this, numbers really don't mean all that much in the big picture of extinction events. Every organism that has gone extinct on the planet had numbers that if you looked at them on any one particular time, you would have been placed into a false sense of security that these animals are able to survive through any kind of extinction event or cataclysmic event that caused their extinction. And again, it doesn't have to be all that cataclysmic. It can be something that sneaks up on you, and these are numbers that are important. I mean, we should know something about the numbers, but the critical part about this is not necessarily the numbers, but what we've been looking at these 111 sites, and that is how many years in a row do these animals not come back to breed in their breeding sites? If the breeding sites are declining, if the increase in the number of sites that no longer harbor horseshoe crabs, and that's about 8%, that is a decline in the number of sites that repeatedly have horseshoe crabs, that is more significant, and that really needs to have a lot more attention. I had hundreds of conversations with people over the years who grew up in New York and on Long Island and said, I remember when I used to go out to Babylon along the shore, and we had to crawl over horseshoe crabs. There were so many out there, and I haven't seen them in years. Same thing with eelgrass, the same thing with other types of organisms along the habitat. Again, what's happening with the habitat is critical. Habitat is the most important part about this. And just to show you a little bit about what adds to the complexity of this and a little bit of the difficulty in sorting totally out whether or not it's a habitat problem is that these animals have a tremendous site fidelity. They will come back to the exact same location, that same population, to breed each year. So let's say they're harvested for all of the animals that are in their single nesting site. Those animals will automatically be eliminated. That population will be eliminated, and maybe that's one of the contributing factors. It's not clear, but just watch this here for a minute. You could see how the change is just kind of this constant kaleidoscope of activity along the coastline, and that's one of the things that we're looking at at Molloy College. So back to IUCN, I'm part of what is called the Scientific Specialty Council and group that is the Horseshoe Crab Specialist Group. We just presented in Hawaii at the World Congress for the IUCN the status, the red listing status, based upon our work back in 2009, published by Springer. And the IUCN is the major conservation largest conservation group in the world, literally. Actually, there are only two groups, two individuals groups that are, one individual, one group, that are allowed to all the time at the UN to give, at the General Assembly, to automatically come in. Two NGOs, as they're called, that come in to allow, one is IUCN, and the other is the Pope. So one has a little bit higher authority, but the idea is that the IUCN has a message. We have this horseshoe crab group now on an international basis, and we're working on the red listing of the other three species. And what the problem is with the red listing is that there's a whole process, and this is the problem right here, data deficiency. As much as we know about horseshoe crabs, we know a lot about limulus, but not much about the other three, and the Asian population. Actually, there's a conference happening at the end of 2017 in India that's going to be talking about Asian horseshoe crabs alone. So the idea of some 50 some odd scientists in Asia, in 8 countries, are basically coming to try to get more data to talk about the status of horseshoe crabs. And the emphasis is in the subcommittee that I chair on habitat, which is very, very critically important. So this is the process here. I don't want to bore you to tears, but the idea is it's a long-winded process. It took us from 2005 to just last year, 2016, to get submittal of the Red List report to the IUCN. And, but paleo survival, the idea of conservation in supporting multi-species, in synchrony, in migratory synchronization, the idea of blood associated with your health or a product from blood for your health, those three critically important parts of horseshoe crab, the aura of horseshoe crabs. But here's the other part, education, truly a big part of that. And in response to that, we have now, through our cooperation with ERDG in Delaware, which is kind of the epicenter for horseshoe crab research, a full curriculum, K-12 curriculum, everything horseshoe crabs, everything you wanted to know about horseshoe crabs, talks, lectures, videos, Vimeos, anything you want, it's on here, all the information you need to get, all the data that we've been accumulating for the past 25 years is on here, all of this scientific works, all of the monitoring programs, and all of the activities that go on. I just want to end with what I think is the biggest pressure right now. Next to habitat is the fact that in New York, it is still a big part of the fishing aspects of conch and eel to use horseshoe crabs as bait. New York State allows the harvesting through permit systems of 150,000 animals each year. They have indicated that it's sustainable. In the peak period of breeding, 138,000 animals are harvested. Now, the only thing about sustainability is if they're able to reproduce. If these animals are reproducing, that's one thing, but now we've removed 150 animals from the reproductive cycle, and they're lost. They're totally lost. They're cut up and used for bait. And nothing against the fishing industry. I have all due respect for the commercial and the aspect of this, but we need to emphasize more on the idea of a synthetic bait, an alternative bait, and a fisheries resource, conch and eel, which is not a U.S. commercial aspect. It is one that is shipped out to Asian populations and to a very specialized exotic food resource. I love the coastline, all times of the year. Born and bred in Brooklyn, I still go back to the coast in Coney Island where I started my first fishing aspects and take a look at a great little place called Plum Beach each year on horseshoe crabs. If you're interested in horseshoe crabs and you'd like to volunteer, partake in that, in any of those, just let me know and we'll get you hooked up. Thank you very much.
Okay, we have time for a couple of questions. If you have a question, please go to the aisle mics because we are recording this. And if you aren't at the aisle mic, your question won't get recorded.
Hey, John, not exactly a question, but a comment. Thank you for this. I think many folks don't understand in terms of the harvesting that it's the females only that are harvested and used for bait. So they're really compounding that loss by harvesting, 138,000 females. Males aren't used. Females are harvested, they're crushed up, and then used for bait.
Thank you, Artie. Yes, absolutely. No volunteers?
We have one over.
Hi, have you noticed any change in the dates of when they're coming ashore over the past, say, 20, 30 years in response to climate change? I mean, there's been a worry that with climate change there will be a disconnect between when the eggs are there and when the red knots and the other birds arrive. Have you seen something changing in terms of the dates in which they're coming ashore to breed?
I have not seen that. I haven't read anything about that. And again, the idea is that it's based upon lunar cycles. So unless you can blame lunar cycles on climate change, I would imagine that that won't be a concern. Now, what is a concern is the possibility of sea level rising conditions coming a little bit further on into the shoreline. But remember, the habitat is exposed to the air at any one particular time, and actually it needs to have be in a liquid cover at some point, and also they need to be oxygenated, which the water is important in doing that. So I haven't seen anything that's there. If that is the case, I'm not aware of it.
Okay, thank you, John.
Thank you.